Hello, and welcome to Girl Meets Gothic, where we explore Gothic goodness in all its guises. I'm your host, Rebecca Cuthbert, and I'd like to thank Travis Bruce, creator of the horror realm, for welcoming me to his channel. This is our first ever show, our first episode, and I am so happy to welcome author, publisher, podcaster, and more, Elsie Marino. Elsie, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. Honored to be your first guest on the show. How cool is that? I don't ever get to say that. That's great.
First ever, and everyone, if I mess up, know that it's me because Elsie is a pro at this, and I'm a newbie. So he's super generous, willing to be my first guest.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm here to talk about Elsie's books, but I do want to mention that his podcast is called The Suspense is Killing Me, and he is the co-founder of So Below Books. So to learn more about all of his projects, go to lucasmarinowrites.com, which is there at the bottom of the screen. Okay. But for his Gothic side, Elsie is the author of the Whispering House series. I just finished book 1, Bury the Girls, and the cover is so beautiful too.
Yes.
So I want to show that off. Burn the Girls. Then we've got Bless the Mother. The prequel to these is Bury the Child.
Right.
And these books are what I classify as suburban Gothic. It's one of my favorite varieties of the Gothic, where we have all of the flavors, all the shades of the Gothic in a sort of suburban setting. So if you would, tell us about how you got started writing this series and whether it was planned or if the series kind of took off on its own and one book became 3.
Yeah, it was planned as a series, but I didn't have this specific series planned the way it turned out. So I did plan a series. I wanted to do a trilogy of novels, and I went through the arduous engineer in me, because my career as an engineer before I decided to do all the fun things, was like, we're going to plot the heck out of this. I want all 3 books mapped out. Like, I want this whole thing kind of planned so that I'll have confidence when I step into the writing to just move like uninhibited and I've got some guidance, that North Star to kind of drive on. And boy, was I wrong about how that was going to go, because I started writing the first book in the series and quickly realized I need to tell a story before this. So I hit pause on book 1, Burn the Girls, and wrote Bury the Child, and that's how we ended up with the prequel novella.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
All right. Yep. Now I haven't read this yet, so not too many spoilers, but is the prequel an expansion of the prologue of Burn the Girls? Sort of.
It okay. Literally precedes the prologue in timeline. So
it's a prologue.
Right. Yeah.
Pre-prologue.
Yeah. Okay. So that's why I ended up with just about 20,000 words. And I thought, well, do I want to make this all one book? I was like, these are 2 very related, but not the same story. And if I were to put them in one book, it would have felt like a drastic shift in care. I mean, you would have spent 20,000 words getting to know and love these characters and then shift hard to a whole nother set of main characters. So that's why I went with a prequel novella.
Okay. So writing Burn the Girls, paused, went back, wrote the prequel,
right,
then went back to Burn the Girls?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Which was a smart thing to do. And in hindsight, I was like, wow, I am certainly glad I did that, because it took the pressure off of me to I think I would have been motivated to condense Burn the Girls had I tried to fit all that in one book.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
I love that. I love the and the advice I think there to people, writing novels that perhaps will become more than that is to be open to having the process change so that the results can be better down the road.
Right. Yeah.
Being open to changing plans mid work.
Yeah, I had a mentor / book coach who was my editor, Zach Bohannon. He's also co-author with me on a post-apoc super like kind of survival EMP thriller series. And so when I was in the process of going, I think I really need to write a prequel novella, he gave me some very wise advice. He's like, hey man, the story's king. Like, don't force this. If that's what you need to do, hit pause and go do it. And then worst case scenario, you go through that process. And if you feel after that they should be together, well, no harm, no foul. You wrote the opening of your book. And I was like, that's that kind of gave me some permission, I guess you could say.
Absolutely. Nothing wasted, it's all for the greater good in the end.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, can you tell us about the overarching narrative that connects these books, or the threads between them, common themes, common players, or places?
Yeah, so the series is set here in southeastern Virginia in the 1960s, and it is essentially, I thought I was writing a haunted house story at first, but what I realized when I stepped back and looked at the way I had structured the themes of loss, grief, atmospheric grief, I really wanted to touch on this atmospheric Gothic feeling that you get when you read books in series like these. I wanted it to be more psychological than body. Mm-hmm. And so those themes really kind of resound in it. I wanted more of a psychological haunting than a physical house, like haunting a family of people. And I also wanted it to have a little bit of it's almost more like there are multi-generations of women in this family living with this enduring curse, more than it is this house being a traditional haunted house. So I thought there was something really strong about the ties between mothers and their children, and then how that kind of translates over the generations. Mm-hmm. And it just strengthens, in my opinion, in the story, it strengthens over the generations. So there's that kind of common theme of enduring love, resilient, timeless love. It doesn't matter if it's life, death, wherever you are, it's there, and it never ends, and it's strong enough to overcome anything. So that was kind of the enduring theme of the series.
I love that. And just so folks know, there is a bunch of ghosty spookiness too. So don't think that that's not there.
You said ghosty spookiness? Ghosty
spookiness is what I'm going to call that, because it's definitely there. And this is not really a spoiler, okay? But I'm going to say the footprints really freak me out.
I
and
love
everybody
that.
else, that's a teaser for you. When you read, you can come back and you can let me and Elsie know if that had the same effect on you.
See, I love that had that impact for you, because when I was writing it, I didn't want to go with these, think about the innocence of a child's footprint. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as a parent, what that means when you see something like, your kids bring home their little handprint in the thing or whatever, or your nephew or cousins or whoever, you see a child bring you something like that. It's like an imprint that they leave on the world that can endure forever. And when I was writing and I was thinking about these footprints in the story, I was thinking about, wow, that is a totally different angle on something that seems so innocent and beautiful. And in this case can kind of harken back to that same emotion, but in a terrifying way. So.
That has a different effect in the end there. And I also wanted to ask you about, and you mentioned this just in passing, that this is historical fiction. So this takes place in the late 1960s. Mm-hmm. We could maybe call that recent historical fiction. I love recent historical fiction. Mm. Can you talk about why you chose to set it in the past? Was that just where you envisioned the story, or is that for logistical purposes, that it sort of could not have happened in contemporary times?
Yeah, it sort of is quasi-logistical. It was like a logic-based thing based on when I initially mapped out the series. I wanted it to occur in multiple generations. And so I had mapped this whole thing out that it would reverse engineer it from the 90s backward. And so just by following this pattern, I ended up in the 60s. And I thought, wow,
Okay.
that's a really cool time period to kind of land on. So I stepped back and just thought about that a bit and said, yeah, I think this feels right.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Yeah. No, I love it. And I think that sometimes moving back just even a little bit in history opens up scary things that even when we think about our childhood are like, that's terrifying. Why did we do that? To think of a 14-year-old just sort of like going out at night with friends with no cell phone, no ride, no nothing. Like we did that all the time. But looking back, it's like, that's really scary. Yeah. And setting things where people, when people did not have access to those GPS, cell phone, calling quickly for help. Like we were really on our own, and it did not really occur to us how vulnerable we were. Yeah. Anytime 90s and earlier. So to see these kids in the 60s, knowing that they didn't have those like very literal lifelines that we have now with technology, it really does add a layer of danger, I think, to these stories.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a total sense of isolationism, like when these characters are separated from their safety nets or from public, which in this case, it's kind of set out in the outskirts of a county where it's very isolated. They are by themselves. Like you could very much exist in this house on this property and no one else really know what's happening. So that was part of it, was just this kind of isolation. There is no safety net. And then if there is one, it's probably not going to be there in time to actually help you.
Yes. There's even, and again, no spoilers, but there's a scene at the county fair. And even something like that should be sort of innocent and safe. It's, first of all, it's not. It is scary, scary. But, just having a county fair separate you, and you could wander that space and still not find the person you're looking for.
Right.
Without being able to text them and say, hey, meet me by the merry-go-round or whatever.
Right.
But these are, when I say kids, what I mean is that our protagonist is a teenager named Constance. She is an older teenager, but she's certainly still a teenager. I loved that she had the 18-year-old marker of like always professing how grown up she was, which is, something that I think we all remember from being 18. And her sister Abigail, who is younger, who's depending on her. And even though Constance is a teenager, this book is very clearly not YA. I think it could be enjoyed by older teens, but reading this, you really get the sense that, this is a book for adults. And so I wanted to talk to you about like pulling that off, writing a book where we have these teen characters, but it's an adult book, and the themes are grown up and sophisticated, and we really don't have like any YA tropes here. How did you decide on that? How did you make it work?
It was actually a little bit of a point of contention for me at the start because I wanted Constance and Abigail to be the center of the story, and I did want to write an adult horror book or gothic, but I didn't want it to be YA as a primary. I thought it was okay if it would fall on a YA audience as a secondary audience, that would be fine. So I drove the book toward a clean adult type of writing where the weight was in the scenes, the weight was in the experiences, and not so much in sex or language or anything like that. I wanted to really let the events kind of speak for themselves. And there was a moment where I paused and said, should I actually do this with Constance in particular? Because she was 18. She sat dead square on that line of leaving her adolescence. And so there's a coming of age element to it. And I thought, well, is this going to be a turnoff for some adults? And I very quickly said, I'd be all right with it if I was a reader, because it gives me the ability to kind of revisit where I was at that time in my life. Well, then you have the obligation to really pull on those strings as an adult and show the adults that are reading this kind of a glimpse back in the past at what they were, but doing it almost from an adult perspective, which from a POV writing, it was a little challenging at times because I really wanted her to have conversations about where she was in life with the adults around her, which you see her have with her not so great dad, her aunt and uncle, her constant struggle for independence. I just really felt like it was something that most adults could pretty easily relate to if they wanted to, and that if a YA reader picked it up, they would know what was happening and they'd be okay with it.
Yeah. I think I can imagine anyone sort of 16 or older really enjoying this, but from an adult perspective, it did bring back that the abject terror of being a young adult, the sort of daily feeling like you should know what you're doing and like loudly professing that you did while internally knowing you didn't at all. You had no idea what you were doing. And I think that we get that with Constance, where she doesn't want help, but you see her at points realizing she needs help. And still being able to count on some family to help her out while not being able to count on another family member who she should be able to count on, and we'll just leave that for the readers to find out. But I thought that was a really great relationship. Part of the reason I liked that relationship is it felt really realistic to me. That relationships between kids and adults are not always easy, and it's not always the adult who knows best.
Right.
So that was really well done.
My mom told me something when I was Constance's age, right around my late teens, and it stuck with me, and it's something that I thought about pretty significantly or pretty frequently when I was writing the story. And that was that my mom told me that when you grow up, you see your parents like other adults because now you're an adult. And as you start to crest that hill around that age of 18-ish, and you start to look at other adults less like a child and more like through the eyes of another adult. And she very clearly is striving for as much of that as possible. And so she's looking at all of these other adults around her, and she's kind of treating them the way she would if she was closer in age to them in some ways. Like the way she's talking to that character you specifically point out. There was a little bit of touchiness when I started writing those dialogues, but I was like, you know what? I'm not going to hold back. This kid is super independent, and she absolutely is going to stand up for herself and the people she loves. And she's kind of emboldened to do it because she doesn't know any better yet. So let all the barrels fly,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's this sort of because when you reach adulthood and you're looking at those other adults in your life, you're sort of at once more sympathetic to them in some ways, and also more critical of them in some ways, because you realize that some of their shortcomings are choices.
Yes.
So that maybe you didn't see when you were younger.
Yes, and especially when they tricky. Impact you. Like yes. Her life is what it is because of that other adult in many ways.
Yes.
So she's a little bitter.
Yes. Yes, and I loved her bitterness. I thought it helped inform her character. It helped inform the story, and it was very deserved. It was very. This was not like, this wasn't teen angst. This was someone dealing with the fallout of a really crappy circumstance in her life. So yeah. So speaking of, you're a parent. You have three, and I'm wondering how that affected or informed writing this series, because I will tell folks that you were not afraid of having your child and young characters go through some hard / awful / horrifying things. You did not, you were not afraid of putting those characters through the ringer.
Right.
Was that easier, harder as an adult with kids? What did being a dad mean when you were writing those characters and those particularly difficult scenes?
yeah, it was kind of I don't know. It was funny because I had this moment before I wrote the series, or even before I dedicated to writing the series, that I said, I want to write something that people feel. And I want to write something that if I look back on it 30, 40 years from now, it doesn't feel campy or time relevant. Like, it feels like something that was grounded in some pretty strong emotional ties, whether whether the writing holds up over 30 years or not of my career, I don't know. I can't predict that, but like, at least the story and the elements of the story will have that kind of timeless reality to them. And of course, like most horror authors, I was thinking, well, what really scares me? Mm-hmm. And as a parent, it's the vulnerability of my children, and also the vulnerability of a family. Outside of just the children, when you really don't have a whole lot of control over the things that are happening to you. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to protect kids from something that that realistically, if it was happening, they wouldn't be protected against. Yeah. So I thought there was an element of reality to injecting youth into the story in that way. I also felt like it was going to be a really strong way for me to connect with the themes of grief and fear, and to be able to put myself in the position of a parent in these situations. It really gave me like I guess you could say like a little bit of like a shot in the arm about like, if I can make myself upset with this, then I know the reader will see or feel something, even if it's not as much as me. Ironically, when I was writing Bless the Mother, I'm like sitting in my living room at like 1:00 in the afternoon, making myself cry. And my wife's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I just wrote this reunion." And I'm like, I'm all worked up about it. And she's like, "Are you crying?" And I was like, she's like, "What's wrong with you?" I'm like, "Well, it's this really sweet moment, but it's also heartbreaking." And she's just like, "Oh, whatever, man." Like, she's just laughing at me because I feel like if I can get that kind of expression while I'm writing it, there's probably a good chance that it'll be sufficient enough for the reader. So it is tough because I do build my kids somewhat into these characters. And for example, Abigail's kind of the free one in the group. She's not really based on anyone around me. I just think she's so much fun. But Constance is a lot like a mix between me and my oldest son. He's at that time in his life. So.
Have your kids read it?
Oh yeah, my 13-year-old is my first reader of every book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, do they give you ratings on scariness? Do they tell you if something is really scary or not scary enough?
Yeah, my daughter, the 13-year-old, she's my heavy reader. She's a critique. She's great. She's a critic. She is pretty funny because I wrote Bury the Child and told her, I want you to put yourself in Adeline's position, and I want you to look at Lydia, the mother, as mommy, and tell me if I'm nailing these or not, because I'm not a mother and I'm not a daughter. So I'm really interested in your perspective as a girl that age, going, living your life with that relationship, if I got close to it or not. She's like, "Oh, this is great." She's super excited about it. And, but it's so hard to scare her. It's almost scary that she's so, like, I'm proud of that as a dad that, you can't really phase her. But at the same time, I'm like, what is wrong with this kid?
Did I do this? Is this?
Yeah, I think I did. Yeah.
But that's a great litmus test or something to have right at home. It's like, if she's scared, then you've got some scary stuff going on.
Yeah, and it's also this, and I didn't write this story for my family, so I want to make a distinction because I think it's a really easy trap to fall into, especially as a newer. If you're putting out a new series or writing a new book and you're relating it to, like, I can read other people's books and I can tell immediately if I know them, how much of them is in the story. Yeah. And I think it can be a little dangerous, as I found out very early in the very second chapter of Bury the Child. So it's 2 chapters into the series. My editor goes, "You got to throw that chapter out. You wrote that for yourself, not for the reader." And I went, "Oh, wow. How did I fall into that trap?" And he's like, "It's too close to you. Like, what's going on in your life like you've got to be a little distant from it in order to make sure it stays with the reader and not with the writer. And so I was very early in the process of writing these stories, made aware of and kept awareness of the fact that even though I can use the influence or inspiration from people in my life, I can't make it too much for them or about people in my life. So anyway, yeah.
Yep. That is a bit of an advertisement for get an editor, everybody. Everyone needs an editor. We cannot see everything about our own work because we are so close to it. So you need that outside perspective to help a story.
Oh, absolutely. And every time I hear an author tell me, oh, how do you get through the tough middle? I'm like, I don't have to worry about getting through the tough middle because my editor is literally dragging me through it by my face. They're like, so my editing process is a little unique, not to get too writer nerd, but I don't wait until the manuscript's done to edit. We edit by the week. So I send them chapters every week and we're kind of in lockstep.
Yep. Building it.
So yeah, exactly. As I'm building their reading and they're giving me a lot of dev edit feedback and line and copy edit right there. And then after that, then we go into a deeper actual edit and proof of the book. But, I do that for that reason. I don't want to step in a pothole too early that I can't get myself out of.
It helps keep you on track the whole time.
Never write alone.
Never write alone. That's good advice. Don't drink alone. Don't write alone.
That's right.
Don't walk at night alone.
That's right.
Okay, so I want to also, getting back to the Gothic a bit, I wanted to ask you about how you chose which elements to include, because the menu of sort of Gothic tropes, conventions, elements is like 50 items long, and they're all so good. Like I would, if I could have a straight diet of Gothic elements, I would say yes to that. But there's only so many you can put in a book. Which ones did you select for what reasons?
I don't know that I really set out to write a haunted house story, which is obviously well-grounded Gothic trope, but it was very quickly made apparent to me that this house was the central location of everything that was going to happen, and that there was like an unbreakable connection between this family and this property. So it had to be, so I had to pull that in immediately. When we were at Horror Reader weekend last year, I mentioned on the panel, which you were so amazingly, you moderated that like a pro. So thank you so much you did a great job.
That's how we met, everybody. That's how Elsie became my buddy, was at Horror Reader Weekend 2024.
Yeah, that was great. So while we were on the panel, we were talking about how the Gothic kind of has like this pull to it.
Yeah.
And I love that atmospheric, dark. I didn't want this story to feel like it was happening in the light the whole time. I didn't want it to feel too grounded in society. I wanted it to have that isolated feel. So I liked isolation. I liked a bit of a slower burn in Burn the Girls than there is in the other books. I liked this immersion that Gothic brings. I like this immersion in dark emotion. Love is a huge, obviously, relationships are significant in Gothic literature. Although I wasn't so much focused on like a relationship between two lovers, which is, romantic elements. I was more worried about the relationship between family members. So those were the ones I pulled down immediately as like tied to the theme. And I really wanted to kind of make this a story that relied heavily on atmosphere and a bit of beautiful fear, because I like in Bury the Child, for example, by the way, the title sounds a little scarier than the book to me actually is, although it is probably the most Gothic of all the books in the series.
Okay.
Yeah, it is completely dark, and it is a completely heartbreaking, very grief-focused novella. But I wanted the mother, Lydia, to fall in love with the haunting experiences she was having, not be afraid of them. I wanted her to be pulled toward these things, not repelled by them. I wanted her convinced, and I wanted her to be all in. So like for me, of some of the Gothic elements, like I feel comfortable in the darkness and in that emotional heaviness that Gothic literature brings. And so those were the kind of the big hitters that I wanted. Heavy emotional dosage, love, isolation, dark feels, a bit of an atmospheric, heavy focus. That's kind of where my primary Gothic pulls were.
I think I might have actually bounced up and down a little bit in my chair when we got to the cemetery in the backyard.
Yeah.
I was like, yes.
There's a story behind that. I had a girlfriend in high school. I moved from the city out to like a suburban area, and it blew my mind when I found out that she lived on an old plantation and they had a family cemetery on their property. I was like, what? I never even thought of something like that could exist. And then there it was. And I thought that's gotta be one of the wildest things I've ever heard of. And so you're welcome. Thank you.
Loved it. Loved it. I should start keeping like Gothic scorecards of the things I read and, giving people the points. And this one gets a lot of points. So,
well, thank you.
And I'm also thinking that I would love to have you back on the show once I finish the series, and then I can sort of weigh in on the rest of my experience with these people and this place.
Yeah,
it'd be super fun. Okay, so one of the last things I wanted to ask about was your Gothic read recommendations. So what have you read recently, or maybe even not recently, and it doesn't have to be a new book, but some other Gothic books you would recommend listeners check out if they haven't already?
Yeah, so it's funny because like most of my Gothic loves have been older publications. Literally just pick up a Poe reader and go to town, right? But that almost feels like the easy answer. And so I really loved stepping away from the horror just a little bit and being almost more deeply focused on almost like a lit fic based Gothic focus in Rose Biggins' book, The Belladonna Invitation. So if you guys want to have fun with it's got so many, it's so flippin' Gothic, it's ridiculous. It's like Parisian culture, turn of the century, gas lamp streets. I mean, the whole deal, like the cultural steps in society, this beautiful woman who everyone wants to be around, this socialite kind of elements of it. It was such a nice departure from like today, and like all the things that we are constantly surrounded with in contemporary literature, that when Antonia Rachel Ward, who owns Ghost Orchid Press, by the way, if you guys want some really good Gothic, go check out Ghost Orchid Press. They carry tons of great Gothic titles, but she brought me Rose Biggins' book and said, you're going to have to read this. I think you'll really enjoy this. And there were some elements to it that I found fascinating. Like there's almost like this Russian roulette element to the story that I don't want to spoil for people, that you have to be rich to afford. Okay. So there's this wild dynamic of being like, I have the ability to do whatever I want, so I'll do the most dangerous thing for me. Yeah. Which is crazy. Well, it's going to go on my shopping list for sure. So thank you. Yes. And I just wanted to say thank you again for coming on to the show, for talking about your series. We're going to talk again. So everybody, there is going to be an Elsie Marino part 2 in the future. So please make sure that you tune in for that as well. And thank you so much for being here for our first show. Awesome. I'm, again, thrilled to be here. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. And thank you so much for hosting. You were absolutely wonderful. Thank you, everybody. And please like and subscribe this show, The Horror Realm, all of it. And also our other show, Paranormal Experience with Elizabeth Broadbent. Another fantastic show, new to the horror realm. So please check all of them out. Thank you so much, everybody.